So the reason we're calling this China Goes Red is because China is the second country after the USSR to adopt a communist system of government. So this unit is Unit 6, which we're calling the Global Cold War. So we're going to look at how the spread of communism impacts other countries around the globe, starting with China and moving into the rest of Southeast Asia, and then also looking at Latin America and Africa. So we're going to kind of hop around the rest of the world here and look at how the Cold War context, as we're calling it, impacts the other countries involved. So we're starting here with China. So we're going to go back and reset our Chinese history here. So from 1611 to 1911, remember that China for 4,000 years basically has been ruled by dynasties and was imperial. So from 1611 to 1911, one dynasty was in power, and that is the Qing dynasty. And so basically, due to a number of internal conflicts that we kind of touched on a little bit in Unit 2, such as the Boxer Rebellion, where people were going around fighting, kind of guerrilla warfare style, fighting Europeans to try to prevent imperialism in China. China was not open to trade with everybody else, so they weren't doing very well because they were not yet industrialized. And a bunch of other peasant revolts and those kinds of things led to a very, very weak government, and the Qing dynasty was overthrown, and China became a republic in 1911. Now, just because they said it was a republic doesn't necessarily mean who has power. So there was a civil war between nationalists and communists for power around the same time as the Soviet Union. So remember the Bolshevik Rebellion, which was basically the kind of the same fight here between nationalists who wanted democracy and communists who obviously want a communist government. That was occurring in the USSR from about 1917 to 1922, so about the same time period here. And ultimately, a nationalist party comes to power here. So in 1925, a man named Chiang Kai-shek took over the Nationalist Party, and he's kind of this strong personality ruler that really takes the reins of China in 1925. And because of this, he was, like we said, he's taking over the Nationalist Party, which is the party in power. So because of this, many communists are persecuted and fled to the country of China to avoid being executed. So the Nationalist Party didn't trust foreign powers based on past actions such as imperialism in Southeast Asia. So they kind of had a shaky friendship with the Soviet Union, but they also didn't really trust the US, so they're kind of isolated in this kind of third corner of a triangle here. So we also, around the same time, remember 1925 is when communism is just starting out in the Soviet Union. It's only 3 years old. We also see the rise of fascism in Italy at this time and Japan, and we see the rise of the Nazi Party, who are also fascists, in Germany. So there's a lot of competing strong ideologies here in the global political landscape. So just to add to your context here, in 1931, remember, Japan invades Manchuria, which is part of China. It is a province in China. So Japan already had power over Korea, so they kind of extend into this territory known as Manchuria, which is touching the USSR. So the USSR is kind of feeling threatened by this. This is another one of those reasons that the USSR was on the side of the Allied powers during World War II. So that's what we're building up to here, is World War II. So just to kind of give you the Pacific perspective here. So by 1937, Japan has all out invaded China. And we, the United States, need Japan and China equally as trading partners. And we have actually a good trading relationship with China at this time. And so that is when we threatened to cut off oil to Japan, because they were threatening China like this, threatening the sovereignty of a state. And that's when they then bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. But basically, by 1937, when World War II is really cranking up in the Pacific, the Civil War stops when the nationalists and communists need to join together against that common enemy. So Chiang Kai-shek is focused on international concerns. He is no longer focused on the internal rebellions going on or these communists that are kind of infiltrating his government. And the Communist Party regroups and becomes stronger. So even though they are also fighting against Japan, they are also gaining strength as a party and gaining popularity among the Chinese people in the 1930s and 40s. So they continue to fight against Japan throughout World War II, not technically an allied power, however, and kind of turn it within themselves again for a civil war. So during this time, Mao Zedong becomes the communist leader and organizer, and he is very, very important, one of the most important leaders we'll talk about in this course, and he is who you see pictured here. So he's very similar to Hitler and Stalin in that he rose up through the party ranks as the leader of the revolution. So he became the single leader of the Communist Party after the defeat of the Nationalist Party during World War II. So this kind of internal conflict is going on at the same time as World War II. So like I was saying, just to give you some historical context to all of that. Unit 2, we were studying how most of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East are under imperial control around the year 1900. Same year, we talked about the Boxer Rebellion to resist European imperialism in China, which was successful. And then about 10 years later, the Qing dynasty falls and China becomes a republic. So 3 years after the Qing dynasty falls, World War I begins. World War I ends 4 years after that. And then kind of right after that, the Russian Civil War results in the Communist Soviet Union. So we have our first communist country being established as the Soviet Union in 1922. 3 years after that, Chiang Kai-shek takes power, communists are persecuted. Then we're kind of seeing the rise of the Nazi Party, Hitler's gaining power in Europe. 1931, fascist Japan also is gaining power and gaining territory, and they invade China in the 1930s. By that next year, Hitler is elected chancellor, and we see kind of the World War II momentum start to pick up here in our timeline. By 1939, World War II begins in Europe. 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, and thus the Pacific Theater also begins when the U.S. declares war on Japan. And World War II ends by 1945, and then China is becoming communist after World War II. So just wanted to give you kind of the timeline arc there. So China officially becomes communist in 1949, and there you can see our lovely propaganda of Mao Zedong again. And Mao is the leader of China until 1976. So that is a long time. It is 27 years? 27 years, yeah. So he is also known as Chairman Mao, so you might hear him called Chairman Mao in a lot of popular culture, or if there are references to him, because he was the chairman of the Communist Party. So a lot of people just called him Chairman Mao, just like saying President Obama. And he was a totalitarian leader, so he enforced strict rule of state. The government had total control. This is a communist state. And he did use a ton of propaganda and secret police force. So here are the reforms, just as a broad overview. We're going to study them more in class, one in particular that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But in terms of his reforms to agriculture, he had three main concerns: agriculture, industry, and the family. So the first reform is that he divided land among peasants, and this is known as redistribution, and this happened in the Soviet Union as well. We didn't necessarily go into too much detail there, but basically he collectivized all the farmland, so he brought all the farmland together, and then he redivided it up. Instead of just the wealthy people owning large tracts of lands where peasants would work, think back to kind of feudalism and how that was, he divided it up into smaller portions, and the peasants had the responsibility for that land, and there was no overall land owner there. So this creates what are known as communes, that are larger tracts of land where all these peasants work, and like I said, he's collectivizing that farmland. It is owned by the government, though. Remember, no private property in communism. So in industry, he has high production goals that are known as 5-year plans. Again, this was kind of a riff on what Stalin did. Stalin also had 5-year plans to jumpstart industry, and we're going to talk about those in more detail in a minute. And he also nationalizes private companies. So instead of there being 5 different shoe companies. There's just one China shoe company. That's it. Then, in the family, he wanted to support women workers as well, and so therefore having smaller families. And also, childcare is state sponsored. So those were kind of 2 of his main pivot points there on the family. So just to give you some more information on these 5-year plans, Mao's initiatives for Soviet-style reforms were called these 5-year plans, and they were obviously accomplished in 5-year intervals. The Soviets were a little successful with these. Stalin was really big on them, but they weren't. They didn't truly catch on, and they weren't really lasting plans. There were 11 of these in communist China, so they were basically the exact same as Stalin's 5-year plans. And really, the goal of them was to jumpstart industry and the economy while putting in place socialist reforms. So basically, these governments and companies, factories and companies were government owned, and the people were paid by the government, and it was their hope they could only spend their money on places that would benefit the government. So that kind of would jumpstart the government economy, which in turn would allow for more education, more enforcement of those socialist policies, etc. One of these 5-year plans was in 1958 and was known as the Great Leap Forward, and it was an ambitious program to expand the success of the first 5-year plan, which was 1953 to 1957. And basically, he wanted to collectivize even more farmland and build even larger communes where the peasants could work. However, there was poor planning, inefficient industries. Industry was not quite up to par yet. Remember, we said that the Soviet Union and China were also similar in that they were not industrialized at the same time as everybody else. So we learned about Western Europe and the United States becoming industrialized about 100 years before this is happening. So they are behind the times. So by 1958, they're still not really picked up on the industrialism thing, and they were also experiencing some crop failures. So this Great Leap Forward was discontinued in 1961. It was considered largely a failure, but also a dramatic enforcement of policy. So it was still an impressive demonstration of a communist government, but overall, it was not successful. So here we just want to introduce the Cultural Revolution. This is really what we're going to be spending our class time talking about next class. So the goal of the Cultural Revolution was to enforce communism in the country by removing capitalist, traditional, and cultural elements from Chinese society. So basically create a whole brand new, purely communist, Maoist, orthodoxy culture within the party and eradicate everything else from society. And after his embarrassing failure of the Great Leap Forward, this was really what marked the return of Mao Zedong to a position of power. So this occurs in the 1960s. Part of this, and part of what made this Cultural Revolution a powerful movement, is groups known as Red Guards. And these were student-formed militia units. So very young, kind of radical, very zealous or enthusiastic college-age young people whose goal was to establish a society of peasants and workers in which all were equal, which is, of course, one of the tenets of communism. So here is just a quote from one of the Red Guard soldiers. Chairman Mao has defined our future as an armed revolutionary youth organization. So if Chairman Mao is our Red Commander-in-Chief and we are his Red soldiers, who can stop us? First, we will make China red from inside out, and then we will help the working people of other countries make the world red and the whole universe. So think about this mindset. They want to they're basically declaring a Cold War on everybody within China, except it was very violent. It was not cold at all. And then they wanted to assist Russia, and the Soviet Union, I should say, in spreading this communist ideology over the entire globe to represent this color red, that Soviet color. You don't necessarily have to write this quote down, but it is a good quote. So basically, they shut down colleges and schools. They didn't want to expand knowledge. They wanted to trap the people in communist China and kind of brainwash them to thinking that this is the best place on earth. And they targeted anyone with extra privileges. Remember, communism is all about equality, not about freedom. And it is anybody who was resisted regime, anybody who talked out against Mao, those would all be denounced or even harmed by the Red Guard in the Cultural Revolution. So this obviously resulted in chaos. Factories and farm production was very threatened, very low, and about 1.5 million people were killed. Millions of others suffered imprisonment, and seizure of property, torture, or just general humiliation. This was a very public thing that they were coming out in. If you came out as a supporter of the United States, that would put you at you were not protected by the laws in China. And this radical movement led to calls for modernization. They saw this kind of as too much. It was almost backwards or barbaric, and it led to a more moderate approach in the end, and the Red Guards were dissolved. So that's where we're going to stop it today. You'll learn more about the Red Guard and the Cultural Revolution, and whether it demonstrates a success or a failure of communism in China next class.